You're listening to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. For basically all of human recorded history, there has been a fascination with the number 3, the Triskelion, which is the symbol of 3 human legs found in ancient Greece. It was found all over pottery that has been uncovered and unearthed through archaeological digs, as well as the triquetra, which was a symbol of the Charmed Ones and their collective power of 3. I'm Robert Walker, author of Session Zero, the DMG to writing great campaigns in any system, and this is my show where I teach collaborative storytellers how to have more immersive campaigns using psychology. And today we are talking about the power of 3. What does that mean exactly? Well, we're going to be looking at 3 different topics in a single episode, and each of those 3 different topics sort of have 3 parts of them or 3 pieces to them. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and meet our guests.
Hi, I'm Chris Pohl. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons as well as Pathfinder and other role-playing games for, probably about 20 years now. Started in high school and played all the way through high school and college. The last couple of years, I've taken a little bit of a hiatus due to work as well as doing a master's degree, but I am getting back at it.
Hi, I'm Nate Pohl. I come at D&D with a background in theater. I've worked in theater all my life and have been playing for a large majority of that.
So today we are talking about something that's a little bit interesting in that we have 3 topics that we're going to be focusing on today, and each of those 3 topics kind of focuses on 3 things. That's why we're calling today the power of 3. So we're going to start by talking about the traditional 3-act structure of storytelling. For those of you out there who might not be familiar with this, it's the traditional play in 3 acts where you have the setup, the confrontation, and then the climax or the resolution there at the end. So if you want to use this in your storytelling around the D&D table, it's very, very effective. In fact, this is the way that I build almost all of my stories when I GM a game. And I kind of do it backwards. I usually start with what the climax or the resolution is going to look like. And then I jump all the way to the beginning and figure out what the introduction is going to look like. And then somewhere in the middle there, I figure out where that confrontation is going to take place that gets them from point A to point C. So you guys have been in a lot of my games. You've seen this structure used over and over and over again. What are your thoughts on that traditional storytelling arc?
That I think the one thing you're forgetting to mention is that usually that confrontation in the middle comes with a very, very heavy side of betrayal.
Okay, yes, all right. That's I tend to lean heavily on the big plot twist or betrayal. You're right. That's way to call me out on my own show. Thanks, Nate.
Hey, I bring it up because it is very effective.
Yeah, no, you're right. It pulls at your emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Betrayal, plot twists, things that surprise us are the things that really stick with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and one of the things is that puts a lot of the times the emphasis in this story structure is to really look at the confrontation and the climax. But, when this idea of betrayal is brought in, the setup is that much more important because you need to establish trust. You need to get the team going. You need to get things moving for that confrontation, or in this case, we were talking about betrayal, to happen.
Well, and typically they go kind of hand in hand. For me, I would say the betrayal is sort of, or the plot twist is sort of the transition from Act 1 to Act 2. It's going from the setup, and the setup is leading to that moment of betrayal or that big plot twist, at which point that moment has taken place. It becomes clear to the players what needs to happen in the confrontation, who they need to confront. So then the confrontation takes center stage at that point.
Absolutely. And I think you could probably look at that transition between the confrontation and the climax in a very similar sort of way in terms of that transition from confrontation to climax is the party by realizing, I mean, bringing into reality all of their plans for how they're going to succeed in that sort of climax confrontation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like in short term, that's like, oh, what buffing spells are we going to cast? You know, in the long term, it's like, what items do we need to gather? What do we need to get? What do I need to enchant? What do I need to prepare?
Well, or what do we need to learn about them? What allies do we need to make? What other roadblocks do we need to overcome in order to get to whatever that final showdown is?
Yeah, and if you break it down, each of those, I mean, we're talking about the power of 3. Each of those 3 acts also have 3 subcomponents of them. So in the setup act, you have your exposition, you have your inciting incident, and you have your big plot point, which what we're talking about is our big betrayal, or it's the plot twist. Then you move into your second act, your confrontation. There's the rising action portion. You have a midpoint, or sort of like a moment where it calms down for just a moment, and then big confrontation, the point where your characters are facing off against the BBEG, or they're solving the great big puzzle that has been set before him. And then in your resolution, you have your pre-climax, your conclusion, and then your after story. Anything else that's your epilogue, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And that epilogue is a very key part as you create sort of your story, as you prepare for the players to sort of move through your world. Thinking about what that epilogue looks like, whatever the bow is on the story, is something to keep in mind as you go all the way through, so that you know your characters and you can see what sort of matters to them in the world as they move through it, so that you can sort of neatly wrap all of that up and provide them with that sort of very satisfying, very sort of cathartic moment at the end of the story.
Well, and to even take this idea, another step, another layer down, that's how a session goes.
Mm-hmm.
You gather and you recap.
Right.
What happened last time? What are we trying to do? Okay, yeah, that's right. And then you have the main point, which is like all the action that happens, trying to, get through the maze or kill a guy or, beat a quest or, trying to find out what you're trying to do sometimes. And then you have your end, which is, do we get experience? Do we level up? Or, what loot do we get? Or
No, I mean, you're very right. The traditional 3-act structure, you're going to see it in like 3 different points throughout your entire campaign, right? You're going to see it used for the story overall. You're going to see it used for your module or your current adventure, and you're going to see it used in every session that you play. So once again, the power of 3 rearing its beautiful head for us. So let's go ahead and move on now to our next of the 3 topics that we're talking about today, which is going to be, we'll call it 3-dimensional characters. And this is what does it take, the 3 things that we kind of distilled down to, what does it take to make a really good collaborative character around the table? And the ideas that I had, and your guys' 3 ideas might be a little bit different, but I'll share the ones I had, is first of all, you need the build on the character sheet. You need a good, effective build that is going to allow your character to be played the way that you want to play it. You need a backstory that is complete with ties to the party and with goals for their character going forward. So a backstory that ties them to the narrative and to the party. And you need a good personality to be able to be engaging and entertaining while you're at the table with the other players. So those are my 3 dimensions of a 3-dimensional character. What are your thoughts on that? Or do you have any other ideas that might fit in there?
I think one of the things for me is I'll maybe take a step back instead of saying for a good character, what about a good player playing a character? And there are, 3 different types. I'll definitely put the first one very similar to yours, Rob. It's about, the structure of the character on the character sheet. How are you going to have them, made up? What about the numbers you have? What about your armor, your weapons, all these things? That's definitely a part of it. Secondarily, I think, the motivations of the player and how that impacts their character, how they play that character out, I think will also have a very significant, impact there. And I think the third thing is how they play that character. It's the difference between I'm good on the character sheet and I play a good character.
for sure.
That difference there.
Yep.
Yeah, that is sometimes, I think, where you get that little bit of a gap between ideal and reality. I have to say for myself, I think I'm very much in line. I think maybe the one thing I would emphasize, I have a tendency to think about it in the language of the theater, but I also maybe usually rearrange the steps a little bit. That I tend to think about sort of who the character is first. What are their goals?
Okay.
What are their motivations? And then I sort of start to think about, well, what kind of abilities do they have? How are they able to interact with the world around them? And then you get into that final step, which is the sort of tactics. And that is, how do they approach the world to try to get whatever it is that they want, to try to fulfill their goals? How do they interact with the world? And that tends to be, I think, where you get that level of personality. For myself, I don't know that I usually think about how I'm going to present so much, because it's really difficult to sustain a presentation that is utterly different from who you are. I tend to approach it much more from the sort of point of view of, how am I going to get what I want? And then I'll just let my personality sort of come through as I pursue a very specific tactic to try to achieve a goal.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I know when Monty Cook was on the show a few weeks back, him and I were talking about alignment a little bit. And one of the things that he said is he thinks it's almost ridiculous to start a game with an alignment, because how are you going to know how you're going to act before you're in a situation and figure out character personality and all of that stuff, which I thought was a very good insight. So he suggests that, after 2 to 3 sessions, allowing characters to make any changes to the character sheet portion that really don't fit the personality or the story that's trying to be told. So give them the opportunity to change out feats if something is more applicable to the way that they're playing, or change their alignment if the way that they are playing or the way they interact with the world is different. I think that's a very good, useful tool to make these things very cohesive with one another.
Absolutely. I think that is a great insight. I have a tendency about that third session is when I start using the retraining rules.
Yeah.
Because that's when I figure out sort of what works and what doesn't. And that's when it's time to start switching abilities because at the heart of it is your goals. And then your abilities sort of dictate how you try to achieve those goals. So if the abilities aren't lining up with the goals, then it's time to lose the ability and do something more effective.
Well, and to harken back to, the session we did a couple of weeks ago, it's one of those things where you also start to learn how your character interacts with other characters and, where that lies and how you want to interact with them. And so that may also be a changing point.
And I think that is a lot of the personality thing. I might go into a game with a concept of what I want a character's personality to look like, but it's never what I envisioned it after playing with the other players, even a little bit. Because I think so much about our personalities is shaped by those around us. And you don't really know what your character is going to present as until you're seeing all of those other things that are around them in their life. And I think that shapes them just as much as the numbers on the character sheet.
I would say more.
Yeah, really. Okay, so our last topic that we're going to have here, and I left the most time for this one because I think this is something that the three of us, Power of Three, are very passionate about, and that is 3-player games. Now, this might sound a little bit ludicrous to some of the cyclothids out there listening, but the three of us have played a number of games with a single DM and 2 characters, 2 players. So we've had a lot of experience with 3-player games. Honestly, off the top of my head, I can't even think of the number. I think Chris is counting them up right now, so he might have the number for you.
Let's put it this way. I am counting the games that have gone over like a year time span. I'm like 1, 2, 3, 4. And these are not like short, one-offs or, a couple of sessions to be done. This is like a sustained long-term game. And I can already count 3 or 4 off the top of my head.
There is something about, because I can't think of any games that we've had 3-player games that were short games. It tends to be, as far as I can think of, when we've had the 3 of us playing in a 3-player game, those games have all been, year-long or 2 years long games. And I think that if you want a game that's really meant to be about telling a good story, try a 3-player game. Try it with one DM who wants to tell a story and 2 players who are interested in being part of a really cool story.
Well, and I think one of the important parts of this is the ability to have great communication between 2 players and a DM. Is the players can really integrate their characters close to each other. Not, perfectly, oh, you do this and I'll do that, but their stories mesh together. And then the GM can really focus on delivering that story and doesn't need to divert so much for necessarily all of the, the personal little stories of the people.
I think that probably the biggest advantage to having only 3 players is that the amount of screen time that each of those players gets is so much bigger that it becomes so much easier to consistently follow through a storyline. You're not jumping around nearly so much. It's interesting because I have a tendency to really enjoy the first movie in any sort of superhero universe. Like when you are telling the origin story of that superhero, I tend to be really invested.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you start throwing multiple superheroes together, you lose me.
Right.
Because you're trying to tell a story that somehow gives each of the superheroes enough screen time that their fans are invested in the movie. But what you end up with is sort of something that I feel like it kind of falls apart because it loses that connective tissue of characters to storyline. And I think that is frequently sometimes also the disadvantage to having large parties is that you lose that sort of energy as you are flowing through the story of an individual character because it gets so chopped up and you have such long downtime sometimes between the particular interests of character. And so much of the advice on this podcast feels to me like it's how to sort of overcome a lot of that. And I think the easiest way to overcome it is to not face that problem.
Right.
Well, and also just side point, outside of the game, it's a lot easier to get 3 people together than 7 people together.
Yeah, it's from a DM scheduling standpoint or a group scheduling standpoint, it's significantly easier to mesh 3 schedules together as opposed to right now we have a total of 9 people that we're trying to get together every week in our current game, which is it's a lot. We have 2 people in the DM position, a DM and an assistant, and 7 players at the table. It is a lot to get everybody there every week. And so we've kind of had to compromise and say we're going to run a game as long as 4 people show up. And we've had to do that a handful of times that we've had just 4 people at the game. But those games also seem to be a little bit more productive. It's not because anybody is being unproductive there. It's just there are so many stories that are trying to be told at the same time. And there's so many heroes. So you're right. It's like a superhero action flick in that we have a lot of different superheroes that are trying to all have their moment to shine and everything. And it's just a little bit simpler with fewer people. Not that I don't love gaming with everybody we game with, but yeah, in terms of simplicity and narrative, the fewer people you have in that narrative, the easier it is to follow a storyline.
From my perspective as something of an aficionado of power gaming, that playing with fewer players means that each character has to be able to cover more bases, and it lends itself towards a more powerful play style because you don't have to cede territory to other players so that you're not sort of stepping on anybody's toes. It lets you really step up to the plate and take your best swing at whatever the problem is because you know there's nobody backstopping you.
Well, and also from a GM perspective, I'm guessing, Rob, since you've, GM'd probably the most out of all 3 of us, one of the biggest advantages there is you don't have to plan so many storylines at the same time. You don't have to plan something for a thief and something for a sorcerer and something for a wizard and something for a barbarian, something for a druid. And yeah, let's throw a monk in there too. There are 2 of them and each of them can have the spotlight at certain times. But if you've got a fighter and spellcaster, you might do a break in every once in a while, but that's not necessarily going to have to be a focus all the time.
Yeah, that is it. That's an accurate point. As a DM, it is much easier to navigate a story for two individuals than try and weave stories together for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 individuals. And to make it still be a cohesive story that everybody is interested in. But I think the other thing that has worked really, really well in our 3-player games with the 2 players and the 1 DM is that we've always done a very good job of having those 2 players be tied to one another, very, very closely connected, either being brothers, as the 2 of you are actual brothers in real life. That has been very easy, or cousins, or just very close childhood friends. But being very tied to one another is much easier in a small group than it is in a really big group. And that also lends to an easier story to tell, because you guys are going to care more about the same story together. You're going to care about what his character is invested in, and vice versa, than it is with, maybe you're tied to 2 people in this party. You're not as interested in what player number 7 is interested in.
The first thing that springs to my mind actually is the conservation of ninjutsu. It's the concept that when you have one ninja in a movie, they're very powerful. But as soon as you get lots of ninjas, they're all mooks.
Yep.
And it's just you only, at any given moment in a game, you only have so much attention and sort of, this is going to sound a little bit crude maybe, but you only have so much caring to give. And so putting all of that energy into one other character creates really tight bonds, as opposed to spreading that same amount of energy out among several other people. It makes it that much harder to really tie people together.
Well, and to add on to that, kind of to play up a couple of things both of you have said, when you only have 2 characters and, let's say one of them gets close to dying, you only have one other person you can rely on to save your butt.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And guess what? As the other person, if one person goes down, you're all on your own.
Yep.
And so it really leads to this idea of you have to rely on each other and keep each other up. Because it's not if, you've got a 7-party group. If one person goes down, that's 1/7 of the power that goes down. Oh no. 2-party group, literally half your power is gone.
Yep.
And from a storytelling perspective, I think that's equally true. Half of the party going down, like, that requires 100% of your attention. Yeah. As the other player, like that is the most important thing that is now happening.
Right.
As opposed to if you've got 7 other players, somebody else can deal with that.
I remember one game with you and I, Nate. It was one of the 2 elf games where we went traipsing into the woods, and I ended up at 2 hit points. We had to hide in a tree for like 4 days just to give me like 2 hit points back so we could get out of there.
Yeah. It makes the combat scenarios a little bit more realistic in terms of when the party is overwhelmed, there is a natural inclination that retreat is an option. I don't think you see that as much in bigger groups. Even if retreat would be the best option, there's more of a concept of let's just power through it, destroy this monster. As long as one person survives, we can bring them all back. But really, in a 2-player game, when one person goes down, that other person's probably going to go down too, because they've lost half their strength. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to tricks of the trade. Today's tricks of the trade is going to be a tough one for each of us at the table, because what I would like each of us to do is we're going to have 3 ideas here for you in our Power of 3 episode of a 3-dimensional character in a 3-player game, and what would the 3 acts of storytelling look like for that character.
I want to clarify. We are each of us creating a character with a sort of story arc
to be played in a 3-person game.
Yes.
So that part doesn't really matter as much, but it's going to mean that probably we're going to have to come up with the idea of a character that is going to mesh well with another character. And what would you want the story to look like that this character would be placed in?
Okay, I've got this. Nate, you and I have talked about this before multiple times.
Okay.
An idea that I've had that I've always wanted to play is a half-orc war priest. The idea being, because he is orcish, there is a lot of, honestly, racism against him, especially from, an area where there's a lot of paladins. Paladins are used to fighting orcs. Orcs always try to raid the town, and the orcs killed my parents, even though my parents were just trying to get us to safety. And guess what? Because of that, I hate the paladins. It's not that I am evil. It's that I see the system and I want the system destroyed because it is perpetuating evil in the name of goodness. So you have this background of, I don't hate everyone. I just hate these specific people for doing this specific thing to me. It would evolve into this idea of a war priest starting a rebellion against what he sees as the lawful tyranny that is perpetuated by knights and paladins of this area, and ends after the lawful system has burned to the ground. He walks away. He's not about the power. He's just about destroying the system because it destroyed him.
Fascinating. That sounds like a fun game. I think a fun 3-dimensional character for a 3-player game following the traditional 3-act story arc would be there's so many 3s, you guys. A young hag in a hag coven. Both players who are players around the game could be part of this coven, so they're tied together in that way. And we'll start off with a backstory of they were born into this. Perhaps they're a changeling, or they perhaps are even a creature that was stolen away from their family and raised in this hag coven. So that kind of adds a little bit of backstory to them and gives them the goal of figuring out, where did I really come from? Where am I really going? Their story arc, the way that I would see it, is the setup would basically be playing early on in completing quests and goals for this coven, working in the traditional sense of being that evil character as an evil hag. But I think the plot twist could be they find out a little bit about their life, a little bit about their background, the fact that they weren't some sort of evil creature to start off with. They came from a different society, and then the confrontation would ultimately be with the society that they were raised in, the family that they were raised with. It would be sort of a hero's journey, stealing the key away from the kingdom that they were raised in to go off on their own, with the resolution becoming their own person, becoming their own individual, and paving their own path. And then there was one.
Okay. I'm going to go with a pair of half-elves. One of them is human presenting in a way that their elven heritage is not obvious. The other presents in a way that their heritage is very obvious. They grow up in a society that is very human-centric and is very lushly civilized, by which I mean a civilization that puts a lot of emphasis on art and other beautiful presentations at the expense of the natural world around them. All of that sort of natural world is just resources to help fuel the civilization. And so the human presenting elf is raised perhaps minor nobility or something of the sort, and the elven presenting one is their slave. And so the plot twist is when the human presenting half-elf learns of their elven heritage, and whether that's from another elf or whether that's from a member of their family, whatever it is, that it sparks this sort of question of, do I continue to support the civilization that is destroying the elven lands, or do I lead the rebellion against this human civilization in defense of what I now know are my kindred?
Fascinating. Really interesting. I like that. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for being on this episode today. I really feel like the two of you are going to have to come back for at least one more episode in the near future so we can complete our Power of 3 recordings. But for now, let's head over to the knowledge check. For today's knowledge check, we're going to be talking about an article from Harappa that is called How to Communicate Better with the Rule of 3. They begin by talking briefly about why 3 is so common and why we see it in so many places, especially in forms of communication like storytelling, novels, or in movies and film. Many of our stories go back to 3, 3 blind mice, the 3 musketeers, the 3 wise men, 3 men in a boat. The 3 is so prominent in fairy tales, myths, and stories, and it has been taken into our modern storytelling method, which is visual film, media. We use that same 3-story arc that we were talking about in this episode earlier, and typically we just sort of knew intrinsically that this was a thing that worked. It seemed to function well. Neuroscience has been able to show us that the reason that 3 works so well is because our mind is attracted to patterns, and 3 is the first amount of objects that you can have to create a pattern. So the rule of 3 is a powerful technique for writing and speaking. It states that any ideas, thoughts, events, characters, sequences are presented in 3s become more effective and more memorable. Hence, in storytelling, it is known as the rule of 3. There is even a Latin saying, omne trium perfectum, which literally means everything that comes in 3s is perfect. So if you are using this at your gaming table, remember to divide your character speeches, like your enemy speeches or descriptions, into 3 parts: a beginning, a middle, and end, and shape it up with, introductions, body content, summary when you're telling narrative portions of your story. Break the body content into the 3 most important pieces, or the 3 core ideas, and use 3 powerful words successively to express your central idea. For example, liberty, equality, and fraternity, which is the national motto of France. And also repeat small sentences, phrases, or words which convey your central message. This will make your narrative portions more impactful and more strong. That's it for today. As always, please feel free to follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and jump on in Google Podcasts or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Leave a rating or a review. Those go a long ways in helping us attract new followers. And I'm looking forward to talking to you next week. But until then, we will see you next session.